Today, we're breaking down a highly complex, rapidly escalating situation that's unfolding right now in the Middle East. We are looking at how a localized military conflict between the US and Iran is sending these massive, immediate shockwaves across the entire global economy. It is essentially a high stakes game of geopolitical chess, and we're going to unpack exactly what's happening on the ground, in the markets, and behind closed diplomatic doors, using the facts straight from the source.
Okay, let's dive right into this because this number is the massive global stake we are all facing right now. $100. That translates to an immediate, painful spike at the gas pump for every single one of us. That is the projected cost for a single barrel of crude oil if this current military escalation keeps up. To really understand how we're hurtling toward that alarming economic threshold, we've got to look at the geography of this conflict.
Section 1. The Choke Point Crisis.
So we're anchoring our narrative right at the geographical epicenter of this escalating war, the Strait of Hormuz. This heavily trafficked waterway has effectively become the ultimate geopolitical weapon. Sea traffic in this absolutely vital shipping lane has pretty much ground to a total halt. The U.S. recently reinstated a naval blockade, actually complete with a proposed 20% fee on passing ships that was later dropped, while Iran has been flexing its own leverage. Remember, just a couple days ago, 2 UAE oil tankers were targeted off the coast of Oman. That prompted the Gulf Cooperation Council to fiercely condemn what they called serious Iranian aggression. And now, Iran's Revolutionary Guards are outright threatening to stop all Middle East energy exports entirely. Both sides are using this strait to basically squeeze each other, bringing international shipping to a total standstill. And that geographical squeeze is directly fueling the physical conflict we're seeing right now.
Section 2. Tit-for-tat military escalation.
Let's zoom in a bit, from the macroeconomy down to the micro, tactical military strikes happening on the ground. This perfectly illustrates the tit-for-tat nature of the current bombardment. If we look at the duality of these strikes, a really clear pattern starts to emerge. The U.S. is focusing its firepower heavily near the Strait of Hormuz itself. For example, they're striking close to the Gulf island of Qeshm, targeting tunnels that store anti-ship missiles, mines, and munitions, all to prevent Iran from threatening cargo ships. Now, on the other side of the ledger, Iran is massively expanding the geographical footprint of the conflict. They're firing missiles and drones across a vast area at U.S. military bases in neighboring Gulf states like Kuwait, Bahrain, and notably, the massive Prince Hassan Desert Air Base in Jordan. But here is an absolutely crucial detail to keep in mind. Despite the heavy bombardment from both sides, analysts are calling these calibrated attacks. Both militaries are deliberately holding back. The U.S. absolutely has the capacity to do massive physical damage, but right now they aren't hitting major population centers or targets inside Tehran. And similarly, Iran isn't going after the huge oil installations, gas facilities, or critical desalination plants in the Gulf countries like they were targeting back in March. Both sides are escalating for sure, but they're doing it slowly. They are avoiding irreversible physical damage that would trigger an uncontrollable, all-out war. However, just because the military strikes are calibrated doesn't mean the economic impact is.
Section 3. The Economic Shockwave.
All right, let's zoom back out to see how these tactical decisions are violently hitting the global wallet. Take a look at the trajectory of Brent crude oil. Days of trading strikes mean oil prices are currently sitting just above the $80 a barrel mark, staying at their highest in about 5 weeks. But look at that projected risk. Former White House energy advisor Bob McNally issued a really stark warning. If the Strait of Hormuz remains shut down and flows aren't restored in the next month or two, the price of oil is going to be pushed directly toward that dangerous $100 range.
And it's really not just the blockade fueling this surge. We are facing a perfect storm of converging global pressures that makes this so incredibly economically dangerous. Global oil inventories are actively falling right now. At the exact same time, major economic engines like China are resuming higher crude purchases, which increases demand. When you combine falling supply, rising demand, and a heavily constrained Strait of Hormuz, you get a recipe for a massive global economic shock. So, with the economy on the brink, you'd think both sides would be rushing to the negotiating table, right?
Section 4. The diplomatic deadlock.
So why did a very recent ceasefire just fall apart so spectacularly? Well, exactly 1 month ago, the US and Iran actually signed a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU. Now, this wasn't a full-blown peace treaty, but it did usher in a brief ceasefire. It was designed to halt the conflict and set up a potential agenda to discuss massive issues, like Iran's nuclear program. And it was loaded with incentives, things like temporarily waiving sanctions and potentially unfreezing Iranian assets. So an off-ramp was briefly on the table.
But that illusion of peace shattered incredibly quickly.
What's truly fascinating and honestly a bit terrifying is how a simple difference in interpretation can spark a war. The MOU used highly ambiguous language, specifically regarding navigation rates through the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. has been interpreting this to mean they can encourage shipping to take a route via the Omani coast, effectively the other side of the strait. But the agreement contained a phrase saying Iran makes the arrangements. The Iranian interpretation, well, they read that to mean they are entirely in charge and ships must route along the Iranian coast. Because of this ambiguity, there is absolutely zero trust left between the two nations. And that brings us to a crucial point, perfectly summarized by Iran's top negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. He recently warned that, quote, a deal only has meaning when its clauses are valid and being implemented. That absolute breakdown in trust over navigation rights is exactly what catapulted the region directly back into violence. As a result, direct formal negotiations currently remain completely frozen. Pakistan, acting as a leading mediator, has been publicly urging both adversaries to halt the current hostilities and get back to technical-level talks. But while public talks are dead in the water, behind-the-scenes mediators are attempting some incredibly heavy lifting. The U.S. is reportedly in touch with Qatari and Omani interlocutors, trying to find indirect back channels to somehow, someway, press Tehran back to the table. But bringing both sides back is way easier said than done, largely because of what's happening at home. Which brings us to Section 5, Internal Political Pressures. We really have to analyze the immense domestic pressures forcing the hands of the leadership in both Washington and Tehran. Both camps are in a massive bind, but for totally different reasons. On one side, you have President Trump facing an immediate electoral timeline. He's dealing with a war that is unpopular in the polls at home, pressure from Republicans to focus on the domestic economy ahead of the midterms, and deep concerns from regional Gulf allies who are really feeling the economic sting. On the other side, Iran's Supreme National Security Council is operating on a highly ideological timeline. They have to appease a very vocal, hardline loyalist base out on the streets who outright reject any negotiations with the U.S., and they view this entire conflict as a literal existential struggle. And we really have to look at how we got to this specific standoff. The initial U.S. strategy, which was backed by Israel, heavily relied on forced regime change. On day one of this conflict, the U.S. killed Iran's supreme leader, who was nearly 90 years old and historically very cautious. But the regime didn't fall. Instead, the U.S. is now forced to negotiate with a new generation of younger Iranian leaders who took over. And these new leaders, they are decidedly less cautious. They are highly ideological and fundamentally believe that utilizing military force actually helps their position. Which perfectly explains their current strategy, captured in this mentality. War and negotiations are two instruments in our toolbox. Iran's leadership is attempting an incredibly difficult balancing act right now. They're using military strikes to appease their hardline base and assert dominance over the Strait of Hormuz, while simultaneously keeping the door to indirect negotiations cracked just enough to eventually secure their ultimate goal, the total removal of U.S. sanctions. And that leaves us staring down a very precarious future. We have two adversaries treating daily military strikes, a critical global shipping lane effectively choked off, and diplomatic negotiations entirely stalled out by a profound lack of trust. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up today's explainer. With domestic pressures mounting on both sides and absolutely no clear off-ramp in sight, how long can the global economy actually withstand this kind of immense localized pressure before that $100 barrel of oil becomes a devastating reality for all of us? Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this, and I hope this provided some clarity on the incredible complexities of this ongoing conflict.